And so we would like you to please use the Q&A feature during the webinar for questions. In the Q&A box, you can post a question and other people can post a question throughout the forum, and you can give a thumbs up if you are interested in that question and want to hear more about that. And we'll try to get as many of those questions answered at the end of all of the presentations from the Ashland Forest Resiliency partners. And if you have a question that's not fully answered, we'll be posting an email at the end where you can send your questions. And we brought you together this evening to share how we're using prescribed fire in the Ashland watershed to improve wildfire safety, and to hear about the latest scientific research, and to share what is upcoming for this controlled burn season. So before we begin, I'm pleased to welcome Belinda Brown. She is our Tribal Partnerships Director for Lomacotsi Restoration Project, for a land acknowledgement. Belinda, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everybody here this evening. We acknowledge and honor the Aboriginal people on whose ancestral homelands we work, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home here today. We honor the first stewards in the Rogue Valley and the lands we love and depend on. The people whose ancestral lands in and around the Ashland watershed include the original, past, present, and future Indigenous inhabitants of the Shasta, Takelma, and Athabascan people. My name is Belinda Brown. I'm the Tribal Partnerships Director, Lomacotsi Restoration Project, co-selected band member of the Ajumawi Otsege Nation. We depend on our relationships with the tribal partners to get this very important work done. And these partners, honored to work with, have integrated Aboriginal fire from the beginning and have utilized tribal workforce to be able to put this important work on the ground and being able to help protect our communities from wildfire that is high severity and very destructive, as we've all participated in and acknowledged and have had to respond to as a whole community. So it's important to understand the Aboriginal Indigenous knowledge and how it marries with Western science today. These are our Karuk tribe partners, and they are actively putting good fire on the ground. Our relationship with fire as a people needs to include the knowledge that fire is medicine for the land, and still today used in our cultural, traditional, and beneficial uses. It's really important that we connect our young people with this intergenerational knowledge that keeps our forests and our communities healthy and well. Next. And as you see, again, this is our Karuk neighbors as we keep those generations alive. The one thing our elders tell us is that we don't speak for ourselves, but for those future generations in honor of our ancestors and for those that have no voice, like the fish and the wildlife. So much of our work is done to protect the wildlife and the habitat that our people depend on for their subsistence uses and their lifestyles. Next. Next. So this is actually homeland of the Northern Paiute Gadutakid people, and I'm going to turn my camera off because I don't want to lose bandwidth. This is the natural habitat of juniper and unnatural encroachment of juniper. So these are family members and also an intertribal project to put good fire back on the land and to be able to protect our communities like we have for time immemorial. And it really is all hands on deck now as we weave the traditions of our past in Aboriginal fire and using fire as a land management tool into the Western science, and being able to work together both collaboratively through all the laws and acts and agreements we can, and also collaboratively on the ground. And firm believer in teamwork making the dream work. Next. That's the end. This is example, seem to have some lag time here. Excuse it if it's coming out on that end of not being able to prepare in the way that we used to prepare for high severity fires, not being able to put fire on the ground and having fire suppression management policies. So you're looking at a sacred site that just underwent the bootleg fire. And as you see, there's a lot of damage. And this is a sacred place that's still utilized by our people today for many purposes. Next. And so now we have a success story that to me, it just is really profound. And so this is where you find Aboriginal fire and our new method of the individuals, clumps, and openings thinning method, that's ecological forestry, and prescribed fire treatment area that withstood that high severity fire. And I just can't say enough how much that was interagency, intertribal, and it's a national model for what we can do and the success we can have when we work together and we're able to put good fire on the ground that could keep a unit of trees looking like this. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Chambers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Belinda, for that really important introduction to this issue. I just want to reflect as the wildfire division chief here at Ashland Fire and Rescue. I've worked in this job for over 19 years now. I grew up here in Ashland, lived here most of my life, raising my family and my kids here. That there is communal trauma and anxiety around the issue of wildfire. Certainly as a result of the Alameda fire, when so many of our friends and neighbors and family were either threatened, displaced, lost their homes. Sadly, even lives were lost in Alameda. But even more than that, over the past decade, we've seen fires all around Ashland. We had the Oak Knoll fire in Ashland, where we had 11 homes burned down and others damaged. We've had the Siskiyou fire back in 2009, where 200 acres burned on the side just off of Tolman Creek in Ashland, and we evacuated hundreds of homes inside the city. We've had fires up in the watershed, albeit small for the most part. We've had fires threaten us from almost every direction. And unfortunately, the projections in a changing climate, getting hotter and drier into the next years and decades, is for there to be even more fire. So it's just imperative that we have these conversations as a community, that we come together in action to create a better future for our community, because we do have so much at risk here in Ashland. As you can see in my background picture, the backdrop to our community is the forest. And you can't tell where Ashland begins and the forest stops, or the forest begins and Ashland stops. We are built into this beautiful landscape, which makes it such a great place to live. You walk out your back door and take your dog on a walk on a trail, mountain biking, running, bird walk. I mean, so many things that are amazing about living here in Ashland are connected to our forests. And yet wildfires, severe wildfires, threaten the very fabric of our community. As we come together, we've been doing this work as the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project for going on 11 years now. Work definitely predates the work that we have done. We're standing on the shoulders of those who came before us, and of course for millennia of the tribes that lived here for time immemorial before them. So it is really important that we reflect on those values, the value of the water that comes off of these hillsides that gives us life in Ashland and makes this all possible. The wildlife habitat values, and then of course our community values, our homes and property, and the economy of Ashland. And we've seen all of those things impacted in other communities who have been negatively impacted by wildfires, all the way to Paradise, California, losing almost their entire community to a fire. And also to reflect that all this work that we're talking about here today isn't the only thing we're doing. There are multiple baskets that we're putting our eggs in this effort, in our fight against wildfire. And learning how to work with fire and through prescribed fire is one of those things, restoring our forests, but also working in our community. We have an entire fire adapted communities program here through the fire department, reaching out to homeowners, helping people understand what makes their property and their homes flammable, and giving you solutions to address that. And also looking at our capacity as a fire department and with our partner fire departments and agencies like the U.S. Forest Service and Oregon Department of Forestry, looking at how we manage fire, how to suppress fire quickly and safely and keep our firefighters safe while doing that. That's all part of a larger scheme where we're working on multiple fronts. So this isn't the only way that we're working to keep our community and our forests safe, but it's an incredibly important one. And so I'm excited to be here with our partners and be able to share some of the work that we are doing and the reasons behind it. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Carrie Metlin, Dr. Metlin of the Nature Conservancy, to talk more about fire.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, Chris. And thanks to everybody out there who's chosen to spend your Wednesday night with us. It's really exciting to be able to chat with you. So my name's Carrie Metlin. I've been with the Nature Conservancy actually here in Ashland for the last 11 years. And it's been my great pleasure to see some really great work happening, some really great community coming around the work we need to do. As an example, here's a prescribed fire going on up towards Ostrich Peak. Really exciting times. So thanks for having me. I was just asked to provide a little of the geographic context and some thinking about, these systems that we work in. So here is an example of how we map out and think about different forest types across the West. And this color green is associated with forest types that historically had relatively frequent fire, and those fires tended to stand and be relatively low severity. Not that there was never high severity, but as a general rule, they were lower severity fire regimes. And here we have a couple of the really good reasons those fires were both frequent and had more beneficial effects on the forest. Both Native Americans, indigenous people, as Belinda was mentioning, stewarding this land for literally millennia and using fire to cultivate lots of different values. And then of course, lightning. And as we all know, we have abundant lightning that happens actually throughout the year, but in particular during times when the vegetation is ready to burn. And so this is something, as you saw, that slate of green was kind of across the West. And so, there's a few really good publications coming out recently that sort of codify these changes that we're seeing. And these changes, you can see here, in the black and white photos, you can see relatively open forests. And then in the green photos, those are examples of sort of contemporary forests that have changed over time. Increasing density, loss of the large trees, shifts in species composition, and increasingly uniform landscapes where the patterning of trees and no trees has actually filled in increasingly with a lot of small trees. And that clearly has huge implications for how these forests function. I mentioned that this is a pattern playing out across the West. We know that it's relevant here in part because of some local work that we've done to quantify historical fire regimes. And so here you can see me and some of the people I've worked with out collecting fire scars. And so here's an example of a tree that's been scarred by fire. And then here's an example of a fire scar sample. Once we sanded it down, looked at the patterning of good and bad rings, doing what's known as cross dating, so that we actually know when fires happen. And I'm really excited that's been published for our local fire histories. I'll talk a little bit about those examples, but then, important to acknowledge that other people have been doing that work too. And so we have a lot of confidence that our region historically had frequent fire regimes of low to mixed severity. Now, an important caveat is that these are very diverse systems. And so here you see a classic example where you have big shrub patches of different kinds of shrubs, grasslands, oak and woodland mixed in with conifers. Our fire history studies are really focused on places that were historically conifer dominated. Lots of good reasons for that, but primarily because ponderosa pine records those historical fires in a way that now we can actually analyze them. The punch, the thing to know is that when we did this fire history study across the Rogue Basin, we found, I was actually surprised by how frequent fires were. So each of these bars is a site, such as these three sites in Ashland, Coggins, Horn Gap, and Winburn. So Coggins, we had this variability in fire return intervals, but the bottom line is that on average, fires are returning to these sites under every 10 years, more frequently than every decade. There is variability around that, and that variability is important for thinking about regeneration and having lots of diversity, but this sets you up for a system that's having a lot of fire. And importantly, that fire was not exclusively in the summer. And so by looking at how those fires actually scarred the trees that were growing, we can get an idea of the seasonality. When did those fires happen? And here across the top, you see historically under different forest types on proportions of spring, summer, and fall burning. But then down here, you can see contemporary fires are almost exclusively in the orange in the summer, okay? All of this paints a picture of sort of a fire regime which is behaving differently. And then finally, it's really important to know how long have our fire regimes been out of whack. And so we know that Native Americans were displaced by 1856. And actually in our fire histories, there are three sites that are kind of near communities. And at those three sites, we saw the fire regimes disrupted in the 1850s. At more remote sites, that fire regime disruption didn't actually happen until in the early 1900s when fire suppression became more of a policy. But still, we see this incredible change that's actually documented in those fire scars. And all of that sets us up for a different relationship with fire. So here we have a study I was a part of where we modeled our expectation based on what we knew about how fires used to perform and compared that to what do fires do now. And what we saw is that from the period of time from 1984 to 2015, we saw 11% of the fires that we would have expected under a natural fire regime. And when those fires happened, they tended to be higher severity, 5 times more high severity fire than we would have expected under a native fire regime. That combined with, as we all know, a lot of clear-cut logging and commercially motivated logging to remove the large trees. And what we find is if we look at ecological departure across Oregon and Washington, down here in the Rogue Basin forests and woodlands, we have a severe deficit of late xeral forest, and that over 50% of that landscape is actually overly dense. And so it needs either mechanical thinning or low to moderate severity fire to start opening up those stands and helping them be more natural. That corresponds as well with wildfire risk. So this was a quantitative wildfire risk assessment that was done across Oregon and Washington. The thing to know is, no big surprise, we have some of the most at-risk parts of the landscape in these two states. And that also corresponds with wildfire risk to communities. Here we have an analysis that was done by the Forest Service to look at fire sheds, places that are delivering fire that's likely to impact communities. And as it turns out, of the 5 top priority watersheds in Oregon, in southwestern Oregon, we have 4 of them. And one of them actually contains Ashland. So there's a lot of really good reasons to be doing this work. From a conservation perspective, we've got the northern spotted owl. Here in the Klamath Provinces, we really hoped that the Northwest Forest Plan was going to help us recover the northern spotted owl. Instead, we've continued to lose their really important habitat at a remarkable rate. And this is just by 2015, 12 to 14% was lost due to wildfires. That has changed markedly after the fires of 2019 and 2020 for the worse. And as Chris pointed out, climate change is going to make all of this more challenging. This is just a map of where we're anticipating fires to be more likely, but in fact, climate change will be increasing fire frequency, intensity, difficulty of control, temperatures. That makes it harder for species to regenerate. There's a lot of challenges that climate change is pushing towards us. So our landscape faces some real problems. Climate change, of course, being one of the primary actually at this point, because of the interacting effects then with ecological process and fire. We have these altered landscapes, and then those altered landscapes kind of constrain our options, but then ultimately we have a lot of ecosystem services that are also, sort of stressing that system. The good news is there's something we can do about it. We have management options. We can manage fire and protect communities. We can promote and protect the complex habitat that's still around, and where we can do the work safely and in a strategic way, we can do proactive ecological thinning. And so these are the things, the activities that the Ashland partners and the Rogue Forest partners, as you'll hear later, are really starting to get involved with. And here's I want to just provide a little bit of the science that shows that, yes, we can do something about the fire situation. This is actually a figure from a paper that was just released. And what you see is, this is in the Eastern Cascades, a pre-treatment stand where they did ecological thinning, keeping the biggest trees, getting more natural spacing. They did a pile burn. And I'm sorry, they did an underburn. And they basically got this stand to be, they hoped, more resistant to wildfire. And then it actually happened. A wildfire came through. And as you can see, that post-wildfire condition looks a heck of a lot like a post-underburn condition. They very much succeeded in changing trajectories. And that's in part because the combination of thinning and underburning is what we need. Thinning is really important for promoting the right species and keeping the big trees on the landscape. But then fire is critical for getting that forest function back and raising the canopy base height, recycling nutrients, and reducing your surface and ladder fuels. Linda already showed this incredible example from the bootleg fire. This is one of the most striking examples I've seen where proactive work with thinning and prescribed fire actually resulted in dramatically different outcomes. And so here you see an area where there was no treatment, where it was actually canopy fire. And you can tell those canopies were consumed. Over here, they actually did the thinning work and they were on track to do the pile burning and the underburning. And unfortunately, they hadn't gotten to it yet. To me, this image really illustrates the fierce urgency to get the work done at meaningful scales. And a lot of thanks to Steve Rondeau of the Klamath tribes, who got a drone up in the air to take this image, because it really tells the story. And I want to drive home, there is a lot of peer-reviewed literature that basically says, yes, treatments work. Can they be overwhelmed by weather? Yes, they can. But even under extreme conditions, treatments moderate fire effect. And they give our firefighters more options for managing fire. This actually has played out here locally as well. So Jenna Volpe with the interagency sort of fire response has gone out and looked at burn intensity at places that were treated versus not. And what she's found in 2014 and 2018 is that, yes, the fuel treatments mattered. They were used, they enabled direct attack, and they were places that burned with relatively low intensity. And finally, I just want to say that, the Ashland Forest Resiliency Project has also done work that matters. The darkest areas of green are where the work that we've done on the ground has improved our management options. It's increased our ability to suppress fires by up to 60%. And what that means is now our fire management personnel have a lot more options for applying prescribed fire and also for responding when wildfires happen. And so with that, I'm excited to turn it over to the Siskiyou Mountains Fire Management Officer, Rob Marshall.
All right, good evening, folks. My name is Rob Marshall. I'm with the Siskiyou Mountains Ranger District of the Rogue Siskiyou National Forest. I'm the Fire Management Officer here, and I've been here for I just finished my 6th fire season here in this position. Prior to that, I spent some time in Montana, and I grew up over in the Tiller area here in Southwest Oregon. So that's most of my career has been here in Southwest Oregon. I get to talk a little bit about what we've done and where we're going with these treatments. And so the first slide you're looking at is the pinkish salmon color you're seeing. That's all the area that we have treated as far as hand piled, thinned, and then burnt piles in for pretty much the last decade. So it shows what we've been doing. That treatment area is 6,260 acres. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the complications of getting this work done and some of the challenges. Working within the Ashland area can be very unique and has some very unique features that make it really difficult to do this work at a large scale. Next slide. So the other big question that people want to know is, so where are you burning now? So the orange that you see in there, those are the units that we do plan to burn this year. These would be pile burning. And, we've been doing that the last couple of weeks. We've actually managed up in the Bull Gap area where we focused so far. We're sitting at about 270 acres burnt, give or take some. And it's important for us to do this kind of work at this time of year. We want to burn these piles when the ground's wet, when there's less issues than moving around on us. And it's really setting up the next opportunity to come in with an underburn and remove some of these fuels in a very controlled manner. Typically, we burn these piles starting in November. Again, it depends on if we can get the right moisture on the ground and the right weather to burn these. And then we go sometimes through March, as long as we can keep the rain. We do kind of a focus strategy on these. We try to hit the high elevation ones first, and we try to stay in a block if we can, a general area, and kind of work in that area. That gives us a lot easier chance to monitor and make sure piles don't move around on us, or if we get a dry spell or winds, it's easier for us to monitor them and also to check to see which units are available to us as we complete the burn. So that's our pile burns this year. We started with 1,222 acres. Again, we're under 1,000 acres to burn. That hopefully we can get taken care of this winter. Next slide. So the green you're looking at now is underburning. After we complete the initial stages of treatment and reduce the fuel, we really get the big bang for our buck as far as fire suppression goes, and really reducing fire intensity by being able to return back to these units and putting a light underburn through it and removing some more of those fuels. And a lot of our fire modeling has shown that that underburn really has the biggest effect on reducing fire behavior out there. So the challenge for us, of course, is it's a lot more controlled. We have a lot shorter time period to be able to get up and get these burns done. And again, we'll talk some more later on about some of those challenges. So to date, we've got 920 acres of underburning done within the watershed. And I should mention that this is all just federal ground. Marco will be talking much later about private, because we do have the all lands treatments that are on private and extend beyond the forest boundaries of Ashland Forest. Next slide. All right, so the blue that you're looking at, those are the units that we have available to us coming into next spring, that if we got the proper drying, these are the units that we are ready to underburn. We have burn plans wrote on these. All of the things we need, the boxes checked, and so we would be looking to burn in these locations. I think it's important to note how these units kind of build on top of each other and kind of start kind of building blocks, if you will. It's kind of like bricks in a foundation. The more of these we can piece together, just the better our field treatments is going to be out there. And when we tie in the work with the private, that's going to be much more efficient and effective for fire, both suppression and the restoration work we're trying to do. And so I'm going to stop with that. We do have 1,500 acres of that ready to go, if I didn't state that. And again, there's challenges around underburning, and a lot of that is smoke related and weather. And I'll talk some more later on about some of those challenges. So now I'm going to hand it over to Marco Bay from Lumikatsi Restoration.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, I'll cue up my PowerPoint here. Okay. Well, this is it's always great to hear our team, share the experience from the indigenous fire history and the present of management of these landscapes by people, hands on the land, to the science of how this is all being threaded together, and the analysis that Dr. Metlin shared, and the partnership with the city of Ashland, Chris Chambers, and having a municipal fire district that has a forestry division, and then the Forest Service and their management, and working across all lands. This term shared stewardship, we are in a crisis with wildfire and forest health, and we all have to come together as a community, as agencies, as non-government organizations, municipalities, tribes, community, to get this big lift done of 100 to 150 years of fire suppression and exclusion, and try to make our forests more resilient. So this map you're seeing here, we talked about the Ashland Forest Resiliency Stewardship Project that's become a national model. Fire knows no boundaries. So as Rob shared, on the federal side, on the Forest Service administered lands, there's been 7,000 acres of that ecologically based thinning, hand piling, some commercial ecological thinning, and then prescribed burning. And then we expanded that work to the private non-industrial lands, and also work on the city of Ashland's lands, forest lands, to accomplish 13,000 acres, 25% of the landscape, as Dr. Metlin talked about, how we can reduce the threat of fire to communities and the forests by this work. We're seeing a pretty significant impact of this effort we've done over the last going on 12 years now. So if you look at outside of the green, you can see that private non-industrial work we've done with private landowners. And this work has been accomplished through the thinning work. And then after we've done the understory thinning, we have to put those debris into piles and stack them up and allow them to cure over the summer and then be ready to burn, like Rob mentioned. And then we're setting the stage for the return of fire through active prescribed burning. We're really just getting started on what we need to do here, as you can hear the acreage. So this is the condition that our forests have been in and are still in. And in Ashland Forest Resiliency, we've addressed this through non-commercial, small diameter thinning, to that photo on the left where we've taken commercially viable trees as the byproducts of ecological forestry and fuels management to set that stage. And we really care about the large old trees. Those are the anchors in the forest. Those are the architecture that we want to protect. The Ashland watershed has a lot of legacy or old trees. So we've made a real strong effort to protect those trees from fire, but also in our management efforts before we burn. You can see those young people there are setting the stage for fire to come in by protecting that tree when fire does come, that we don't burn up the roots and we care for that tree. And when we thin, we're thinning around those trees and then we're returning fire. So habitat values, protection of the community, like Chris Chambers talked about, all this takes a lot of hands on the land. It's a very labor intensive process. And then these byproducts of ecological forestry and thinning, these small diameter logs, can then be utilized through a stewardship agreement that we have and reinvested back into more good work, prescribed fire, maintenance work. So a lot of effort there as well. And you can see the conditions of these forests as we talk high level. The boots on the ground, the people on the day-to-day that are doing this work, is really dangerous. There's a lot of unraveling of 100 years of the exclusion of fire. It's going to require a lot of meticulous work, and it's dangerous work. And this is the condition of a lot of our forests throughout the Rogue River Basin and the West. So we've expanded this model of Ashland, you can see in the blue, to a new initiative called the West Bear All Lands Restoration Project. We were actually up on the ground yesterday, and this goes from Talent all the way to Jacksonville, mostly on private lands. We've attracted some funding, expanded our partnership, working with municipal fire departments of Jackson District 5, Jacksonville Fire Department, Oregon Department of Forestry, local contractors and operators, and a whole suite of partners through the Rogue Forest Partners, which I'll talk about in a minute. That green is a project funded through the Federal Emergency Management Agency's Hazardous Fuels Project program. And we're tying these landscapes together. We're trying to change the profile of the fuels and get these forests in a condition that when fire comes, it's going to be less intense, as everyone's been talking about. So this is the Anderson Creek area, and it's Ashland Forest Resiliency has been a model, and we're building upon that. We're building upon the adaptive management work and the monitoring we've done, the practice of restoration, the use of fire across private and federal lands. So back up on the AFR project, we've treated on the underburning close to 600 acres of underburning on private lands, 170 acres on city lands, and about 370 acres on some of the private lands that are strategically located in the watershed. We want to expand that model here to the Anderson Creek project. And you can see the red shows that high severity of departure of the forest, but also risk to the homeowners and the community. This is just outside of the footprint of the Almeida fire, not too far. And these are a lot of the conditions around homes that we're addressing right now. We have crews on the ground. We're treating about 300 structures that we're going to protect by home site defensible space work, but also ingress and egress. So we are increasing wildfire safety by thinning along roads, strategic ridges, and it also provides an opportunity for more tactical suppression, but also prescribed fire opportunities in the future, because we have to maintain these forests after we've done that ecological thinning work. And then looking across the Rogue River Basin, Dr. Metlin talked about this strategy across this landscape. We've seeded these projects with funding from the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. You can see the Ashland Forest All Lands project there on the right, the West Bear project, and then across the Rogue River Basin, these areas that really pop that need restoration work. The Upper Applegate Watershed, where the Siskiyou Mountains Ranger District is under Rob's watch for fire, and across the community of Williams, Upper Briggs near Josephine County, in the Illinois Valley, the Stella Project up near Prospect, and Salt Creek up in the Southern Cascades. We're threading together this model and moving it across the basin to treat, hopefully thousands of acres that we have online. So this takes a workforce, this takes capacity as we're beginning to scale up and take this model across the basin and really across the region. We want to create meaningful living wage jobs for the people that live here. These are the hands that touch the land. Folks from Central Point, Medford, Ashland, and starting to scale that workforce, develop those skill sets, increase capacity in prescribed fire. The Prescribed Fire Training Exchange that's been hosted by the City of Ashland with the Fire Learning Network of the Nature Conservancy to try to build skills in the private and the public sector to continue this good work. And just today, right near the Mountain Meadows community, this is a tribal crew from Klamath Falls that's employed by Lomacatsi. We're restoring riparian habitat, but we're also reducing the blackberries, as we saw in the Almeida fire. That was an intense wind-driven event that burned through the riparian zone. So we're threading together all these workforces, private sector, public sector, in an all-lands approach to continue this good work across the area and improve our ecology and habitat. Thank you.
Thanks, Marco. I'm going to pop back on for a minute here. I hope as you've heard various speakers here that you get the message that although we are in an urgent situation with wildfire, I think we all realize that. We look at the news every summer, we see gigantic fires, 500,000 acres, up to even 1 million acres burning in the Pacific Northwest and Northern California. So there is a sense of urgency along with this, but there's also a strong sense of hope that we can conquer this issue. We can make our communities more fire safe. We can bring our forests back to health and resiliency. And part of that is this work that we've done as a model through Ashland Forest Resiliency. So Ashland is very much at the cutting edge of this issue. And some communities haven't even started doing work yet. We're actually, a decade and more ahead of the game where some folks are at right now. So yay for us here, but we still have a long road to go. And we really need to double down on the work that we're doing with the burning. Rob showed you the map of the burn units. We need to be burning at least 1,000 acres every spring, and what we call the underburning, where we're actually reintroducing fire across an entire area. So far, we've only gotten up to about 450 acres in a year, and that was this last spring. So we really need a doubling and more than a doubling of our output of that spring underburning, which is one of the most important things that we can do for community safety. So that brings up questions of how do we know where to go? So Sarah's going to pop open a couple of slides right now to describe the process of strategic fire planning that we've been engaged in with, in particular, a researcher from Oregon State University named Chris Dunn. Chris has brought this amazing product to us, and with the partnership through the Nature Conservancy and doing monitoring of our project, where we're able to use an amazing data set, part of which we've collected through our workforce on the ground, and some of which is been collected through satellite data. But this process is called potential operational delineations. And it's kind of a mouthful, but just called pods for short. If you see the yellow lines on this map, that's where we've divided the landscape up into little bite-sized chunks that are similar enough in nature that we can give them characteristics, assign data to them, and Chris Dunn has done an amazing analysis for us, looking at the values within what each of those pods across the landscape. Some are more important for their watershed and habitat values. Others are more important because they sit right next to the community and they are key for protecting homes, businesses, and our economy in the city. And then we're going to take all that data and mash it up in a big data sandwich. Sarah, you can go to the next slide. Using the pod's boundaries to help create priorities. So here's that the big sandwich of data on the left. SDI stands for Suppression Difficulty Index, measures of where on the landscape it's hardest to put fires out. And we're probably not going to be very successful. Looking at another one called Potential Control Lines, or PCL. Where do we have the best opportunities to manage fire in the watershed and forested areas? And looking at where fire is going to have the biggest impact, negative impacts, maybe in some places very far away, which we don't really have much of on our landscape. Fire could have a positive impact. And then combining that with the values we have for our drinking water and fire protection of our community, using some super sophisticated fire models, smashing that all together to give us what we call the strategic containment unit prioritization. Basically just taking those pods or those bite-sized chunks of our landscape and saying, where are the most important places to accomplish the work that we need to accomplish. A lot of the initial work that Marco showed with crews on the ground, cutting trees and brush and putting them in burn piles, and then getting those piles burned, which we're still in the process of finishing now, like Rob explained. But then coming back with that underburning. And what really shows up in that graphic with the containment unit prioritization is that the community is the most important thing. All of the red is centered right around the edges of Ashland because we give a lot of weight to protecting the community. And so that tend to be our highest priorities in getting our burn projects done, but also the biggest challenge, because the closer you are to town, the more that smoke can impact the community. Rob's going to talk in a minute a little bit about that smoke management process. You understand a little bit better what hoops we have to jump through to get smoke in the air and get this important work accomplished. But nonetheless, we are asking, and we have a great video that just came out. Maybe we can post that link at the end, talking about the need for increased fire and for community tolerance of increased smoke, because those priorities are driving us to do work right next to the community where it's most important. Sarah, can you get the next slide there? And go back to the presentation mode if you can. Yeah, there we go. So one of the awesome things, Carrie alluded to some of this also, is that we can also measure our progress using that data. And that's something Chris Dunn has done for us. As before we started doing work, this is back from around 2010, the data showed that there was going to, if we had a fire then, there was going to be a lot of big flames. So what you see in red and yellow are flames over 10 feet, which are higher severity fire, which equals bad outcomes on the landscape and for the community. And then we were able to run that same analysis after our work, decade of work is completed, which is the next slide, showing that it was a conversion to a lot of green, which means flames under 10 feet on the landscape. So we've taken a lot of potential for bad fire and turned it into potential for mild fire in the summertime. So there's still a lot of work to do on the landscape. We have areas that we know are vulnerabilities, like just below the Siskiyou Summit there and Neal Creek on Wagner Butte, the upper Ashland watershed, where we haven't been able to do any treatments yet. And that's going to have to be another project years down the road as we get done with the areas that are most important near the city, and we're able to maintain those with continual burning to keep the fuels low. So that gives you a peek into how we are able to use data, science, research, and apply that and come up with priorities for the work that we really need to get done to secure our community and create a resilient watershed. Rob Marshall now is going to talk a little bit about the process we go through for every one of our controlled burns to give you an idea the complexity that we deal with.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so just from the federal side of things, you know, every unit that we burn out there has to be covered under a federal burn plan. That burn plan is pretty extensive. It defines the area, what we're burning, the parameters in which we can burn, and also it defines contingencies for if things were to go wrong or if somebody were to get hurt, how we would respond to that. A big key piece of that is smoke. And smoke is definitely a very important issue to the Rogue Valley. And it's one of the big challenges that we've been dealing with here. Fortunately, you know, when I stepped into this, there was a pretty strong partnership going in this project already with the Nature Conservancy, Lomakatsi Restoration, City of Ashland, and the Forest Service. You know, and that partnership really helped build some good, credible data and be able to use that to our benefit with the smoke managers. Those that don't know, Oregon Department of Forestry actually is in charge of smoke management for the state of Oregon. And so each unit we burn, we have to get, on our side, it's not considered a permit, but for the private side, it would be considered a permit to burn. And so we have to get permission, basically from smoke and clearance. And we do that every day. They issue a forecast comes out about 2:30 in the afternoon. We'll look at that and it kind of gives us some general guidelines. You know, out here in the Applegate, I have a lot of leeway. I can look at that forecast. If it looks good, I can just plan smoke. In Ashland, almost always it means I have to call the forecasters and talk with the forecasters. And we have a conversation about what smoke we're generating and what that may look like and how it could impact communities. The challenge is, you know, if you look at the picture of the watershed behind Chris Chambers there in his little image, you know, it's the watershed is built really wide at the top. And then it kind of funnels down into, it almost looks like a perfect funnel, if you can imagine that. And our issues are, of course, that in the evening, right about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we start seeing a wind shift. And that wind shift goes to a downslope wind. And that terrain really helps drive smoke down into and empties right into Reeder Reservoir and possibly the city if it can spill out. So we typically try to have all of our ignitions done by 3 o'clock before we get that wind shift. That helps with some of that. You know, we often have residual, so we do get some smoke down there, but we try to take those measures to get smoke cleared before that shift happens. And that's one of the measures we do use. When I first got here, you know, we were lucky to be getting 2-3 days a year to burn piles. And since then, we brought in, you know, we were basically able to partnership with NOAA, the Weather Service, and the smoke forecasters, and they really bought into trying to help us widen our opportunities to burn, and looked at our area pretty hard and worked with us, and they've really opened up opportunities for us in private land burning. So huge work in progress, and we're still learning, and we're still trying to test those boundaries and figure out how we can burn without impacting, or at least limiting as much impacting as we can to people who use the watershed. So that's smoke has been our huge challenge, of course. And I think the other piece of that, that I just like to talk about is, as I mentioned, we're trying to build those blocks, and we have some pretty short time frames to get that burning done. Once we can get that initial underburn done, our hope is to be able to go back in a few years and we can reburn that area with another underburn, because we're never going to be done treating the landscape. As Chris mentioned, we'll be going back to some of these acres and retreating. That retreatment should come a lot easier for us. We should be able to get larger blocks. We should be able to produce a lot less smoke, and because we've already consumed those heavier fuels out of there with the pile burns and the initial underburn. Let us treat a lot more landscape quicker as basically a maintenance. And with the work that's been done on the private lands, that also helps build those blocks. There's a lot of talk right now about increasing capacity, so a huge shout out to the people that are trying to build burn organizations and associations and private. I think those are going to be key to add capacity to some of these treatments as we continue to try to do the landscape level treatments. And I think that's all I was going to mention right now. So I will
Thank you,
pass
Rob.
to Sarah.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for discussing smoke. That's a little bit about what I want to share with the community. And so the city of Ashland has a community response plan for smoke, and this was adopted in January of this year. And we went through a process with local businesses and organizations, the Chamber of Commerce, Jackson County Health Authority, and the state of Oregon, Oregon DEQ. And we adopted this plan, and it helps us with organizing our communication, and particularly with vulnerable groups who are prioritized, and the actions that we can take to reduce their exposure to smoke. And so it also increases our ability to implement prescribed fire, because we're able to have more flexibility in planning those prescribed fire days. And this is overall going to improve our wildfire protection long-term if we can get more burning done on the landscape. And I wanted to point out a few resources as we have our controlled burn season. I'd like you to try to visit ashlandwatershed.org, where you can sign up for notifications. I know a lot of you are out recreating in the watershed, or even just taking an evening walk like Rob was describing. Smoke may come down from some of our burning. And it's challenging too in communications, because we start our burns at high elevation and you won't see a lot of smoke in town when we start our burn season. And then all of a sudden we'll start getting closer to town and burning in places like Siskiyou Mountain Park and West Ashland, and smoke will come in and people will be caught off guard. So we're trying to fill in the gaps with that, with our community response planning, to make sure that we reach people with the education that they and resources they need to reduce their exposure to those particles. And it also helps us during the summer when we have smoke. This last year we had 36 days of unhealthy air. So I think resources that we have posted on ashlandwatershed.org and smokewiseashland.org will help you in making decisions about how to make changes at home, and then also, when you should be taking a walk or where you should be taking a walk when we have our burning. And so smokewiseashland.org is not only an online resource, but it's also been a great way to organize in the community. It's a business, it's a private public partnership. And one of the best accomplishments we've had to date is getting out 600 air purifiers to people who are lower income and most vulnerable families and older adults and people with pre-existing conditions are able to apply for a purifier and get one free of charge with the help that we got from our partners that were organizing with Smokewise Ashland. And so I wanted to share those resources. If you, I'll be posting my email here in the chat so that if you don't have any of your questions answered in the forum, or if you need more help accessing those resources with Smokewise Ashland, then we'll go ahead, or ashlandwatershed.org, then I'll go ahead and get those to you. So I think that what we'll do is I'll turn it over to Chris Chambers, our Wildfire Division Chief, and he can check in the Q&A. I think some of those questions were answered as we went along, but if he could go ahead and answer some of those, that would be helpful. And he'll pass it around to panelists who can answer those better. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for putting questions in the chat. Perry had a couple. Hi, Perry. Good to see you in the chat at least. And it sounds like we did answer your first question about the pile burning. And then your this second question, I'll just read aloud, as the approach to start the thinning and prescribed burning with the deepest, thickest forest areas first, moving toward the communities, or does planning for this work begin with the communities moving outward into the surrounding forested area? Maybe there's not a standard approach. Actually, there is a standard approach, and it's part of our original Ashland Forest Resiliency project design that came out of a collaborative effort actually out of the community to get this project designed. The design actually starts at the community and radiated outwards. We've been, over a decade of work now, so we've reached those farther points in the watershed, which is why you see where we're burning right now is the points further away from town, because the work has already been done nearest to Ashland, but we still have to maintain it, and that's important, and that goes on ad infinitum as the forest is always growing, and we want to make sure that we're securing those areas closer to town as much as possible. And some of them we haven't been able to get to underburn, but we have done the initial fuels thinning and pile burning in that area directly around town, including the private lands, as Marco mentioned and Rob mentioned as well, that we've been able to bring under the umbrella of the AFR project. So some forests in the watershed, and we don't, and I want to make it clear, we don't treat everywhere. Not every acre is having trees thinned and brush cut. We have a lot of areas that are reserved for wildlife habitat. We want that diversity in the watershed. So the deeper, darker forests along stream sides are often reserve areas for species like the Pacific fisher and northern spotted owl. There are big blocks that we've had to leave for habitat protection, especially for spotted owl. But we try to integrate a lot of those features into the work that we've been doing. And we really want that diversity of habitats, from open forests that have had fire in them to closed, dark forests that haven't seen fire in a while and are a different habitat kind of type. So we've got some of each out there, and that is part of a healthy landscape. So thanks for posing that question, Perry, much appreciated. Darren from the Nature Conservancy, one of our partners, thanks Darren for putting a question out there. How long will it take, if the desired funding materializes, to get the dry forests back into balance? Anybody want to jump on that? Maybe either Marco or Carrie? And then in your question, Darren, I'm assuming you're talking about the dry forests of the Rogue River Basin, or maybe you're talking about dry forests in the whole Western United States. I don't know. But maybe we'll just tackle in the Rogue Basin dry forests.
You want to take that, Carrie?
Well, the problem with a question like that, as Darren well knows, is it's very conditional. So at the current pace of how we address the landscape, it would not happen. But in the Rogue Basin strategy, which is a forest restoration strategy for 4.6 million acres, we try to get to about a quarter of that landscape, 1.1 million acres in 20 years. That won't work with the current capacity and the way we do business. But as we begin to speak more cohesively, as we begin to plan more strategically, and we begin to build capacity, and that's where Marco actually is going to have a lot to say about building capacity and a workforce which can do this ecological work well. Our hope is that we can get to that sort of pace. And so funding will help, but ultimately it's going to take shared vision and people who are really knowledgeable and know how to get the work done in an efficient and effective way, as well as the support of the community, the understanding of the work that needs done, and then support for the kinds of measures it takes to do that work. On to you, Marco.
Yeah.
And actually, Chris, you may want to talk about how the city of Ashland is actually kicking in to help with that funding.
I think I just add across the Rogue Basin, you know, we're having to treat a pretty significant amount of acres a year if we scaled up. And in addition to the workforce, we want to continue to support our mill infrastructure. We're going to have to remove some in an ecological way, small diameter material or logs, and that would support more work. But, you know, we're looking at close to 20,000 acres plus a year over the next 30 years that we'll have to be implementing this type of work to achieve that 1.1 million acres around. So a lot of scaling, and we're starting to see that scaling. We're fortunate to have been selected in partnership with the Forest Service, the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, for the Collaborative Landscape Forest Restoration Program, which will provide some significant resources over the next decade, you know, upwards of $38 million. This work is very expensive, and we're hoping to treat about 146,000 acres with some of those dollars. And then some of the funding through Oregon, state of Oregon, through Senate Bill 762, through Governor Brown, that Chris can talk about, that will support a lot of work across private and federal lands. So our elected officials see the wildfire issue. All hands are on deck. We do need to scale, and it's in the process. And hopefully with this infrastructure bill, we're going to see more dollars coming to the ground. But how are we going to be ready? That's the challenge, where a lot of us here are, you know, we're not sleeping at night all the time, but we're very committed. A lot of work to do and a lot to put together.
Yeah, thank you, Marco and Carrie. Indeed, we are really on the precipice of something very exciting now. Funding and momentum is really building. The city of Ashland has contributed to the AFR project through you all who are watching. If you're a part of the city of Ashland in the city limits, you pay a water bill, you pay $3 a month towards forest restoration and maintenance in our watersheds. And so that's money that comes back to us to put work on the ground to get more prescribed burning accomplished every year. So that's an important contribution. As Marco mentioned, the state and federal level, there's new funding that is imminent right now. The state Senate Bill 762. I did see that Senator Golden was on here earlier. If you're still there, Jeff, thank you so much for all of your support, as well as Representative Pam Marsh for getting that through the legislature. That is really an unprecedented investment from the state level in wildfire response and prevention and forest restoration. We've already seen some money from the state this past year that's benefited that landscape that Marco pointed out, the West Bear behind Talent, Jacksonville, Phoenix, but also we got $175,000 this last year from the state for work in the Ashland watershed and in communities in Ashland as well. So that's happening, and it's only growing. And with the passage of the infrastructure bill at the federal level, there's dollars earmarked there for climate adaptation and wildfire mitigation projects, just like the one that we're talking about here, and expanding that effort. So I think for the first time in 20 years that I can think of, we are really on the edge of something that could transform our future. It's going to take some time. We can't erase 150 years of growth in the forests and the lack of fire overnight. But in the coming decades, we're starting to see a pretty bright future. Well, perhaps one more question did show up in the chat. Oh, Sharice, thank you. Are there any plans to adjust the AFR project to address the impacts of accelerated climate change in the entire watershed? As is, the AFR project was not designed as a climate change adaptation project. The planning for AFR began in 2004. Yes, climate change was happening in 2004, but that wasn't the impetus for this project. So what we're gonna have to do is go back to the drawing board because the NEPA or environmental plan process wasn't designed around climate change adaptation. So we're gonna have to get to the point where we feel like we're confident in maintaining the forest with fire and to the scale that we need to, and then re-engage with the community, the Forest Service, and other partners to create that kind of climate adaptation plan for the entire watershed. But I will say right now, on 1,100 acres of city and parks land that's in the watershed in the community, the Ashland Forest Lands Commission is engaged in that process of creating a climate adaptation plan for forests. So that's something the city's on the cutting edge of, along with our Parks Commission, and it's pretty cool to have that happening in our community. All right, well, folks, I think we're ready to shut down for the night. I just want to thank everybody out there for tuning in. This is being recorded, and we will post the recording of this so it can be shared out to others in the community who weren't able to attend. We'll make sure we make that resource known to everybody out there on our mailing list and post it on the AFR website, again, ashlandwatershed.org. And other folks can just tune in to hear more about the work that we're doing. So thank you all for your support and your tolerance of smoke. Importantly, we're going to keep putting smoke in the air in the safest way possible. But know every once in a while you might see or smell smoke. But I hope that be protected, but also know that it's giving us hope for a better future in our relationship with fire in our forests. Thank you all the panelists for all being here after 5 on a weekday. Much appreciated. And hope everybody has a great night. Take care.